So I'm walking along in my neighborhood. Actually, I'm near my son's school right now. Anyways, I was thinking about how people greet each other, because as I walk along, I usually greet people that I see. And I was thinking then about how we greet each other in a more physical way, like handshakes and stuff like that, and fist bumps. And I was thinking to myself, well, I'm told that the origin of the handshake is because in the old days of Europe, if you were shaking each other by the hand, you couldn't have a dagger in that hand ready to stab the person you were greeting, which meant that you were, unless you're dealing with a southpaw or somebody who was ambidextrous, you're fairly safe. And given the fact that in those days the left hand tended to have a negative connotation to it, you probably were fairly safe. Not 100% obviously, but fairly safe. Anyways, so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking of how one of the greatest ways, aside from sex, to transmit diseases is through touching things. Now, I'm not a germaphobe person, but if the thought has crossed my mind, handshakes are an excellent way to transmit diseases. I mean, we do it all the time, not just because we're shaking hands with other people, but because we're constantly touching things. We touch our face, we touch our nose, we touch our ears, we rub our eyes, we touch tables and chairs and rails and various other things all day long. We don't go around washing our hands constantly, which probably is not a good thing anyways, because you wash too much and then you destroy the good bacteria, and some of the bad bacteria could be left behind that could get inside of a wound and seriously infect it. But that's beside the point for the moment anyways. So I was thinking, what's better? And with the advent of the fist bump, I think a lot of people would admit that a fist bump is less likely to transmit some kind of a bacterial infection or fungus or viruses or whatever than a handshake. It's probably a significantly lesser risk, because you're less likely to use the backside of your hand to touch things, except for, like that, something like that. And in addition to that, you're exposing less of your skin to the skin of somebody else, and you don't usually use your hand, the back of your hand, to touch very many things, as opposed to the front of the hand where which you use all the time. So the amount of bacteria, viruses, and fungus on the back of your hands is going to be less. And since you're using a fist bump, you're reducing the rate of infection. Now, of course, if you are sick, you've got a runny nose, you may be doing this, but you may also go like this. So in that respect, you're still going to be fairly likely to transmit diseases via a fist bump. So, having lived in Southeast Asia, I know of other ways to greet people other than handshakes and fist bumps. And some of them are different kinds of handshakes, where basically you put your hands together, extended, kind of like like the way Christians would pray, and then you clasp the other person's hands that are in a similar position to some degree, and through that you're also going to transmit a large amount of diseases, if there are any on your skin, especially because you're using both hands instead of just one hand. And in Indonesia, a lot of people, instead of using toilet paper, they will use their left hand. And you're supposed to, of course, wash, but not all bathrooms have a place where you can wash your hands. Therefore, it's quite difficult in public places, even in better malls. It's often a problem because there may be toilet paper, but for people that don't use toilet paper, they're not going to. So that's a problem. You add to that often there's no soap in the stall, so you cannot immediately wash your hand before you pull up your pants and stuff and buckle up and whatever, which means you're spreading whatever is on your hands, hopefully nothing, but probably poop. And that means that it's being transferred to the articles of clothing that you're touching with the left hand. So when you do a two-handed handshake like that with somebody, you're not only getting the usual assortment of germs that you would get from a one-handed handshake, you're also getting poop. Now, this is not to say that there aren't people in the West who don't forget or are too lazy to wash their hands after they, wipe their butts with toilet paper. But there are fewer of those than people who don't carry around hand sanitizer or soap in order to wash their hands promptly after using the toilet. So this is a serious problem, and actually typhoid is a very big problem in Southeast Asia because, at least in some parts anyways, because of this tendency not to carry hand sanitizer, not to carry soap, and then have public bathrooms, even school bathrooms, that are not equipped with what should be required for health considerations. So as you can see, even the Indonesian style of clasping hands, and it may just be the fingertips, it may be most of the hand, it depends on whether the person is the opposite sex, whether you know the person, and other factors that affect how much of the hands touch each other. In the most extreme cases, I guess you could say, because of a difference in gender and not knowing the female, you may not actually touch hands at all, or maybe just barely touch the fingertips without even clasping at all. So they would just be like, this hand is, the tips of the fingers just barely touch the tips of the fingers of the other person. So clearly that solution is no better than our solution, and for the traditional Western handshake, and actually in certain parts of the world is going to be worse because of what I have described. So what are the alternatives? Well, I think it's fairly obvious because I've been in Asia, but maybe it's not so obvious for you. So clearly, if we want to reduce the risk of transferring diseases, the best way to do that would be to use a form of greeting, I'm not talking about speaking, I'm talking about physical, that avoids entirely the use of hands touching hands. Okay, so what does that leave us with? Well, long ago in Japan and other countries, they used to bow to each other. They didn't use their hands at all. So that would be one solution, and I think that would be an excellent solution because you don't even have to have free hands in order to do that. So I think that would be the optimal choice, is to bow at each other. But for those of you who just can't help yourselves and insist on doing something a bit more proximal, I guess we could look to the other common solution where you clasp hands with yourself and present yourself that way, sometimes with a bow, and that could be either the hands, one hand closing over another hand, kind of like if you watch some of those old Chinese movies, you see a person bowing with one fist wrapped in the hand of in the other hand. Or you can keep the hands open and pressed together, like I described before, like the praying hands they're called sometimes. And then just, instead of extending them to the person you're greeting, you just hold them close to your body. Now, on rare occasions, instead of two hands, you'll see somebody go like this. And that would be another choice. So, ultimately, I think it's a matter of personal preference. Now, I know that there are people who firmly believe that they can judge the character of a person based on their handshake. And I would say that that's pretty naive to believe that a handshake is going to determine somebody's character. Because quite frankly, if you are, say, a psychopath, I mean, we can look at some of the famous psychopaths like, I'm believe his name was John Wayne Gacy. He was a politician. He gave lots of handshakes and he was very good at it, and yet he was a psychopath. So does a handshake give you a fair gauge of a person's personality? No, it doesn't. You can be fooled if the person knows and chooses to use the appropriate type of handshake. So we come back to the problem that the best choice in order to avoid the transfer of germs is quite simply to use a non-touching method of greeting each other physically. And so that also excludes some of the other traditional methods I saw in Indonesia, which are also practiced in Europe and in certain cultures in America, where you kiss the cheeks. Or in some cases you sniff each other. So it's, which is something that's generally done to children or somebody you have affection for but is of the opposite sex, or even of the same sex. It depends on the person. It's highly variative. But I would say that if we have an interest in reducing the transfer of diseases, that the best thing is to look to the traditions of Asia, where you're bowing and or you have your hands raised, either a clenched fists method or the praying hands method, or even just one hand that's open. And I think that would be more than sufficient. Or if you prefer, you can live long and prosper. Except not everybody can do that with their hands, strangely enough. So please feel free to make your comments and try to be constructive about it. I'm not really interested in highly emotional responses. I'm not interested in trolls. I am interested in logical discussion of this. Thank you.